I had spent 3 years turning my life into a perfectly stacked house of cards, only to watch it collapse in a single keystroke, until the coldest woman I had ever met decided to catch me before I hit the ground. Welcome back to the channel. If you're ready for an intense, slow-burn girl love romance that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps bring more of these stories to life. Part 1: The Breakdown. The email arrived at exactly 5:14 p.m., glowing with a cruel, radioactive brightness against the dim lighting of the university library. I had opened it with the kind of blind, desperate arrogance that only comes from absolute sleep deprivation. For 3 solid months, I had lived off stale black coffee, protein bars, and 4-hour intervals of rest. I had memorized every anatomical structure, every obscure textbook footnote, and every impossible case study that Dr. Harper Vance had relentlessly thrown at our advanced pre-med cohort. I believed, with a foolish, dying hope, that hard work was an absolute guarantee of success. It wasn't. Tatus failed. The word didn't just sit on the screen. It punched the air entirely out of my lungs. There was no paragraph of explanation, no gentle letdown, no partial credit for the pieces of my soul I had ground to dust in this library over the semester. Just the raw, icy knowledge of what that single word meant. My medical school scholarship was instantly voided. The residency placement I had been practically guaranteed was gone. The look of immense, suffocating pride on my mother's face, the pride that had kept her working double shifts at a diner back in Ohio just to help me pay for my undergraduate textbooks, was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. I sat staring at the screen until my vision blurred into a watery, stinging mess. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible, tightening vice. Quiet hum of the library suddenly roared in my ears, turning into a deafening static, and I knew that if I didn't get out of there immediately, I was going to scream and tear my hair out right in the middle of the study hall. I shoved my laptop into my bag, ignoring the harsh scrape of the metal zipper against my knuckles, and practically ran. I didn't wait for the elevator. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the East Wing and bolted toward the oldest, least populated part of the science building. It was an abandoned, glass-ceilinged botanical stairwell that smelled faintly of damp earth, rain, and disuse. No one ever came here. It was the perfect place to fall apart. By the time the heavy fire door slammed shut behind me, my legs gave out completely. I collapsed onto the third concrete step, my backpack sliding off my shoulder and hitting the floor with a heavy, hollow thud that echoed up the spiraling staircase. First sob ripped out of my throat, ugly, jagged, and violent. I pressed both hands over my mouth, terrified someone would hear the wretched sounds I was making, but my body had completely betrayed me. I was hyperventilating, dragging in ragged breaths that didn't seem to contain any actual oxygen. Every sacrifice I had made, every weekend I had spent locked in my dorm while my friends lived their lives, everything I had built to become someone important, it was all gone. Panic was absolute, a suffocating black tide rising over my head. I was crying so hard that my ribs ached, my vision swimming in the dim grayish light filtering through the dirty skylight above. Then the heavy fire door clicked open. I froze, a trapped animal caught in the absolute worst moment of its life. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying with every fiber of my being that whoever had wandered into the stairwell would just take one look at the pathetic, weeping girl on the stairs, feel a momentary pang of awkwardness, and quietly leave. Emma. The voice was low, authoritative, and terrifyingly familiar. My stomach plummeted straight through the concrete. I opened my eyes and looked up through my tears. Standing on the landing above me, holding a sleek leather briefcase and looking as immaculately put together as ever, was Dr. Harper Vance. She was the youngest tenured professor in the department, a brilliant, terrifying force of nature who commanded absolute respect simply by walking into a room. She was currently wearing a tailored charcoal suit that fit her tall, slender frame perfectly, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant clasp at the nape of her neck. Even at the end of a grueling Tuesday, there wasn't a single wrinkle in her blouse, not a hair out of place. She looked like she had been carved from marble and ice. And she was, without a doubt, the absolute last person on earth I wanted to witness my humiliation. Dr. Vance wasn't cruel in the loud, obvious way. That would have been easier to handle. She was worse. She was surgically precise. She was the kind of professor who could dismantle a student's entire thesis with a single raised eyebrow and a soft, devastating question. In my very first seminar with her, I had eagerly answered a question, only for her to hold my gaze with those piercing, stormy gray eyes and say, "That was very enthusiastic, Emma." Unfortunately, it was also completely incorrect. I had burned with shame for weeks, replaying her cool, detached tone in my head. She demanded perfection, forgave no sloppiness, and seemed to exist on a plane entirely devoid of human weakness. Now, those same gray eyes were taking in my disheveled hair, my tear-streaked face, and the desperate way my hands were trembling against my knees. I tried to scramble backward, to stand up, to say something, anything, to excuse the pathetic display. "Dr. Vance," I choked out, my voice cracking humiliatingly in the cavernous space. I'm sorry. I was just leaving." "Sit down," she commanded softly. It wasn't a yell, but the sheer, unwavering authority in her tone made my knees buckle again. I dropped back onto the concrete stair, my chest heaving as another wave of uncontrollable panic hit me. The humiliation was choking me like thick smoke. I squeezed my eyes shut and turned my head away, trying to muffle the sounds of my own ragged breathing behind my fists. I expected the sharp click of her heels turning away. I expected a cold reprimand about emotional regulation in the science building, or a reminder that a doctor must maintain composure under pressure. Instead, I heard the soft rustle of expensive fabric. I opened my eyes and gasped. Dr. Vance had descended the stairs. She set her leather briefcase carefully on the landing and then, to my absolute shock, crouched down on the concrete step just below mine, bringing us directly to eye level. The faint, elegant scent of bergamot, rain, and cedar wafted over me, cutting cleanly through the dusty smell of the stairwell. "Look at me," she said. Her voice was quieter now, missing its usual icy academic edge. I shook my head, my shoulders trembling violently. "I can't. Please go." "I am not going anywhere, Emma." "Look at me." There was something so anchoring in her voice that an obedient, exhausted part of my brain forced my head to turn. Her gray eyes locked onto mine. Close, the marble facade wasn't so impenetrable. There was an intense, piercing focus in her expression and something else, something that looked shockingly like genuine, unfiltered concern. "You are hyperventilating," she said, her tone steady and deliberate. "You need to slow your breathing or you are going to pass out on this staircase, and the paperwork for that is notoriously tedious." A broken, watery sound escaped my lips, a laugh that turned instantly into another sob. "I failed," I gasped out, the words tumbling over each other. "The exam. I failed it. It's gone. Everything's gone." Her jaw tightened slightly. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell me it was going to be okay, or that it wasn't the end of the world, because she was smart enough to know I wouldn't believe her anyway. Instead, she reached out. I flinched, expecting her to hand me a tissue or point to the door. But Dr. Harper Vance laid her hand gently on my knee. Touch was like an electric shock. Her palm was incredibly warm, the contrast against my cold, trembling skin making my breath hit sharply in my throat. Her long, elegant fingers gripped me with a firm, grounding pressure. "Right now, you are safe," Harper said, her voice dropping to a low, hypnotic register that I had never heard in the lecture hall. "Nothing is actively hurting you. The exam is over. But you need to breathe for me. Can you do that?" I shook my head frantically. "I don't know how." "Yes, you do." She shifted closer. Proximity was dizzying. I could see the faint pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, the subtle weave of her expensive blazer. "Follow my count. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Do it with me." She inhaled deeply, exaggerating the movement of her chest so I could follow. I tried, but my breath hitched, sputtering into a miserable gasp. Again, she instructed patiently, not removing her hand from my knee. Do not focus on the exam. Do not focus on tomorrow. Focus entirely on the concrete beneath you and the sound of my voice. Inhale. I squeezed my eyes shut and tried again. This time I managed to draw a shaky breath in. "God," she murmured, and the soft praise sent a strange, involuntary shiver down my spine. Hold. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. With every ragged breath I took, she was right there, counting softly, her thumb making slow, tiny, almost imperceptible circles against the fabric of my jeans. It was an impossibly intimate gesture from a woman who usually looked at students like they were inconvenient obstacles. The steady, rhythmic pressure of her warm hand was the only thing keeping me tethered to the earth. Slowly, agonizingly, the roaring in my ears began to fade. The tight, crushing band around my chest loosened just enough for me to pull in a full, deep breath without choking. Panic receded, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion that made my bones feel like lead. I opened my eyes, suddenly acutely aware of how close we were. Our knees were practically touching. Her hand was still resting on my leg. I could see the individual dark lashes framing her striking gray eyes. The fierce, untouchable professor was kneeling on a dirty stairwell floor for me, completely ruining the line of her designer suit. The shame rushed back in, hot and stinging. I pulled away, wiping furiously at my wet cheeks with the back of my hand. "I'm sorry," I croaked, my voice sounding wrecked and small. "This is completely unprofessional. I'm so humiliated." Harper finally pulled her hand back, though she didn't stand up. She watched me with a completely unreadable expression, the storm in her gray eyes swirling softly. "Do not apologize to me for having a human reaction to distress, Emma," she said smoothly. "And do not call it humiliating. It is merely biology." "You must think I'm completely pathetic," I whispered, staring down at my scuffed sneakers, unable to hold her gaze anymore. "You warned us. You said only the top tier would make it through. I guess I just proved I don't belong here." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. I waited for her to agree. I waited for her to give me a cold, clinical lecture about the harsh realities of the medical field and how emotional fragility was a liability. Instead, I heard her sigh. It was a soft, tired sound that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. "Look at me," she repeated. I forced my eyes up. "You failed one paper," Harper said, her voice dangerously soft, yet carrying an absolute, undeniable weight. "You did not fail your life. And you certainly did not prove that you do not belong in my program. You are one of the most brilliant students I have ever taught, Emma. I do not waste my time on people who lack potential." My heart stuttered. Did she just say that? Dr. Harper Vance, the woman who had never given out a compliment higher than adequate in her entire, formidable career? Before I could fully process the words, she stood up, brushing off the knees of her immaculate trousers in one fluid, graceful motion. She picked up her briefcase and looked down at me. "You are entirely too pale and you are shivering," she noted crisply, the imposing professor persona snapping back into place, though her eyes remained unusually soft. "My office is on the 4th floor. You are going to come with me, you are going to drink a cup of chamomile tea, and you are going to wait until your hands stop trembling before you attempt to walk home." "Dr. Vance, you don't have to. I am acutely aware of what I do and do not have to do," she interrupted smoothly, offering her hand to me. "I am not asking. Come along." I stared at her outstretched hand, the long, delicate fingers waiting patiently in the dim light. The sheer absurdity of the situation warred with the overwhelming exhaustion in my bones. I had no fight left. Trembling, I reached out and let the coldest woman on campus pull me to my feet. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Eye of the Storm. The walk to the 4th floor felt like a surreal, out-of-body experience. I followed Dr. Harper Vance through the cavernous, dimly lit hallways of the science building, the silence between us heavy but no longer suffocating. Usually, walking a few steps behind Harper felt like trailing a highly controlled explosive. Today, it felt strangely like walking in the slipstream of a protective shield. My legs still felt like water, my breath hitching every few steps as the aftershocks of my panic attack rippled through my chest. Harper didn't rush me. She adjusted her typically brisk, commanding stride to match my unsteady pace, her expensive leather briefcase swinging slightly at her side. She didn't look back to check on me, which I was intensely grateful for. I didn't think I could survive meeting her piercing gray eyes again while my face was still blotchy and tear-stained. We reached the end of the East Corridor, where the faculty offices were tucked away from the chaotic energy of the undergraduate labs. Harper paused in front of a heavy oak door with a frosted glass pane that read, Dr. H. Vance, Head of Neurological Studies. She unlocked it with a sharp click and pushed it open, stepping aside to let me enter first. I hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of how disheveled I looked. My oversized college hoodie was swallowed by the intimidating elegance of her world. "Inside, Emma," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument though it lacked its usual sharp edge. I stepped over the threshold, and the heavy door clicked shut behind us, instantly muting the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I had never been in her office before. Students rarely were, unless they were facing disciplinary action or defending a flawless dissertation. I had always pictured it as a sterile, terrifying interrogation room, all harsh lighting, glass, and steel. I was completely wrong. The office was surprisingly warm, illuminated by the amber glow of a brass desk lamp and the fading evening light spilling through a massive floor-to-ceiling window. Smelled richly of old paper, cedar wood, and that same intoxicating hint of bergamot that seemed to cling to her skin. Bookshelves lined 3 of the 4 walls, packed meticulously with massive medical tomes, but there were signs of humanity, too. A dark emerald green cashmere throw was draped casually over the back of a leather reading chair. A tiny, beautifully crafted brass owl sat on the corner of her massive mahogany desk, right next to a stack of color-coded, ruthlessly graded essays. It was a space of intense discipline, but it was unmistakably, intimately hers. "Sit on the sofa," Harper instructed, slipping out of her tailored charcoal blazer and hanging it on a wooden rack by the door. I moved mechanically toward the plush leather sofa tucked beneath the window and sank into it. I felt incredibly small. Without the armor of her jacket, Harper looked subtly different. The crisp white silk of her blouse clung to the elegant lines of her shoulders, her sleeves rolled up neatly to her elbows, exposing the pale, smooth skin of her forearms. I hated myself a little for noticing the quiet, devastating grace in the way she moved. She walked over to a small mahogany side cabinet where, to my surprise, a sleek electric kettle and a collection of loose-leaf teas were arranged with absolute precision. She flipped the kettle on, the quiet rushing sound of boiling water filling the room. "I don't want to take up your evening," I mumbled, my voice still raspy and weak. I hugged my backpack to my chest like a shield. "I know you're busy." Harper didn't look up as she measured chamomile into a silver tea infuser. "If I were too busy to be here, I would not be here. I do not do things out of a misplaced sense of charity, Emma. You should know that by now." That was true. Dr. Harper Vance was practically famous for her complete lack of sentimental indulgence, which made this entire situation, the stairwell, the hand on my knee, the tea, all the more dizzying. She poured the boiling water into 2 heavy, dark ceramic mugs and carried them over, setting one on the glass coffee table in front of me before taking a seat in the armchair directly opposite. She leaned back, crossing one long leg over the other, her posture flawless even when ostensibly relaxing. "Drink," she commanded softly. I reached out with trembling fingers, wrapping both hands around the hot ceramic. The heat seeped into my icy palms, anchoring me slightly. I took a tentative sip. It was perfect, not too bitter, intensely soothing. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the warmth travel down my throat. When I opened them, Harper was watching me. Her gray eyes missed absolutely nothing. They tracked the slight tremor in my hands, the dark, bruised exhaustion under my eyes, the defensive way my shoulders were hitched up to my ears. Now, she said, her voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. Tell me exactly what happened with that exam. The shame clawed its way back up my throat. I don't know, I whispered, staring down into my tea. I studied. I swear to you, Dr. Vance, I knew the material. I spent the last 3 months living in the library. But when I sat down and looked at the paper, it was like a wall came down. The words started swimming. Halfway through the second section, my brain just stopped. I couldn't pull the information out. You panicked, she stated. It wasn't a question. I blanked. I just stared at the page while the clock ran out. I knew I was failing while it was happening, and I couldn't stop it. My voice cracked on the last word, the raw, ugly truth of it stinging the air. It's my medical school scholarship. It was tied to maintaining a 3.8 average. With this fail, my GPA drops. The review board is going to pull my funding. I can't afford this university without it. Harper remained perfectly still. She didn't offer a pitying sigh. She didn't give me a meaningless, hollow reassurance that things happen for a reason. And your family? She asked quietly. Will they not assist you? I let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. My mom works double shifts at a diner in Ohio so I can afford to eat while I'm here. She's been telling everyone in our town that her daughter is going to be a surgeon. She bought me a stethoscope when I got my acceptance letter. She keeps it on the mantelpiece. A fresh, hot tear slipped down my cheek and I furiously wiped it away. I can't call her and tell her I ruined it because I couldn't handle a 2-hour paper. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was contemplative. Harper uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. The sudden shift in proximity made my breath catch. She was close enough now that I could see the faint silver flecks in her stormy eyes. Emma, listen to me very carefully, she said, her voice dropping into a register that felt dangerously like a secret. You did not fail because you lack intelligence. You failed because you ran your nervous system into the ground until it forcibly shut you down. I looked up, stunned by the absolute certainty in her tone. I have watched you all semester, Harper continued, holding my gaze captive. You answer questions with a depth of understanding that your peers cannot even begin to grasp. But I have also watched you lose weight. I have watched you come into my 8 a.m. lectures running on caffeine and sheer frantic willpower. You are brilliant, but you are treating yourself like a machine. And machines break when you do not maintain them. I had to, I whispered defensively, though the fight was bleeding out of me. I don't have a safety net. If I'm not perfect, I lose everything. Perfection is a myth for the anxious, Harper replied, her tone sharp but undeniably gentle. What you need is resilience. And resilience requires allowing yourself to stumble without deciding the race is over. She reached across the low glass table. For a second, my mind short-circuited. I thought she was going to take my mug, but instead her long, cool fingers lightly wrapped around my wrist. My pulse skyrocketed instantly, hammering violently against the delicate skin right beneath her thumb. She had to feel it. There was no way she didn't feel the sudden, frantic leap of my heart, but if she did, her expression didn't betray a single thing. Her touch was grounding, authoritative, and completely paralyzing. There is a reset period for the advanced pre-med cohort, Harper said smoothly, her thumb brushing against my pulse point in a tiny, almost unconscious movement that sent a shockwave of heat straight to my core. It is an administrative clause designed for extreme circumstances. If a student fails a core module but has maintained an exemplary record otherwise, they are permitted to retake a secondary version of the exam in exactly 4 weeks. My eyes widened. The department never advertises that. The dean hates granting resets. The dean, Harper said, a faint, razor-sharp smirk touching the corner of her lips, will do exactly what I tell him to do, provided I personally sponsor the petition. I stopped breathing. The air in the office suddenly felt incredibly thin. You would sponsor me? I would not sponsor a failure, she corrected softly, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip completely upside down. I am sponsoring a momentary lapse in an otherwise exceptional mind. She finally withdrew her hand, and the immediate loss of her touch left my skin feeling strangely cold. She picked up her own mug, leaning back into the leather chair, looking every bit the untouchable monarch of the faculty once again. You have 4 weeks, Emma, Harper stated, her voice returning to its crisp, professional cadence. You will sleep 8 hours a night. You will eat 3 meals a day. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 6 p.m. you will come to this office. I blinked, my brain struggling to process the rapid shift from devastation to salvation and the even more dangerous reality of what she was proposing. To your office? Yes, Harper said, taking a slow sip of her tea, her gray eyes watching me over the rim of the mug. If I am putting my professional reputation on the line to force a reset through the dean's office, I am going to ensure you pass it flawlessly. I will personally tutor you for the remainder of the month. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. The most feared, demanding professor in the university, a woman who actively avoided interacting with undergraduates outside of mandatory hours, was offering to spend her private evenings tutoring me. Alone. In her office. I don't know what to say, I breathed, genuinely terrified that if I blinked I would wake up back on the concrete stairwell. Thank you. Dr. Vance, I thank you. Do not thank me yet, Emma, Harper warned, the faint smirk returning, making her look devastatingly beautiful in the dim amber light. My private curriculum is significantly more demanding than my public one. I will not accept anything less than your absolute best. I won't let you down, I promised fiercely. I know, she murmured softly. The look she gave me then wasn't academic. It wasn't pitying. It was something entirely different, something assessing, heavy, and thrillingly dangerous that made a slow, hot knot of anticipation curl deep in my stomach. I had walked into this office thinking my academic life was over. I was walking out of it realizing that something far more perilous had just begun. End of Part 2. Part 3, The Anatomy of Control. The 4 days leading up to my first private session with Dr. Harper Vance felt like existing in a strange, suspended state of gravity. I walked through the campus with the surreal, vibrating knowledge that I had been handed a lifeline by the very woman who regularly failed half the junior class without a second thought. I tried to adhere to her rules. I truly did. I forced myself to sleep for 7 hours a night, lying in the dark while my mind raced in frantic circles around gray eyes and the phantom warmth of a hand on my knee. I ate 3 meals a day, much to the profound shock of my roommate Chloe, who watched me consume a full plate of pasta on Monday evening as if witnessing a genuine medical miracle. Who are you and what have you done with the caffeine-addicted ghost that lives in my dorm? Chloe asked, leaning against the kitchen counter with her arms crossed, her dark curls tumbling over her shoulders. I'm resetting, I muttered, stabbing a penne noodle with far more aggression than necessary. I got a special dispensation from the dean. I have 4 weeks to retake the module. Chloe's jaw dropped. The dean? The same dean who told Marcus Henley to reconsider his entire life path when he asked for an extension on a lab report? How on earth did you pull that off? I hesitated, the food suddenly turning to ash in my mouth. I hadn't told anyone about the stairwell. I hadn't told anyone about the way Harper had knelt on the dirty concrete, or the way she had pulled me into her office and dismantled my panic with terrifying surgical precision. The memory felt too private, too fragile to expose to the harsh light of a college dorm room. I had a faculty sponsor, I said carefully, keeping my eyes fixed on my plate. Who? Chloe pressed, her eyes narrowing with sudden, predatory curiosity. Dr. Vance. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the mini-fridge. Chloe stared at me, her eyes wide, before she let out a short, incredulous laugh. Harper Vance? The Ice Queen? The woman who made a senior cry last week just by staring at his bibliography? She's not an ice queen, I said defensively, a sudden fierce flash of protectiveness surging up in my chest. She's just exacting. Exacting, Chloe repeated flatly. Emma, she looks at students like they are an offensive odor. You're telling me she went to the dean for you? She's also tutoring me, I added, the words rushing out before I could stop them. Starting tomorrow, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Privately, in her office. Chloe didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at me, a slow, knowing expression settling over her features that made the back of my neck burn with sudden, inexplicable heat. Right, she said slowly. Just be careful, Surviving her class is one thing. Surviving her undivided attention? That's a whole different battlefield. By the time Tuesday evening rolled around, Chloe's words were echoing in my head like a warning bell. At exactly 5:55 p.m., I found myself standing outside Harper's heavy oak door on the 4th floor. Corridor was completely empty, the rest of the faculty having cleared out hours ago. The silence was thick and expectant. I smoothed my hands over my jeans, suddenly hyper-aware of the fact that I had spent 20 minutes deciding which sweater to wear. It was ridiculous. I was here to study the intricacies of the central nervous system, not to go on a date. Yet, my heart was hammering violently against my ribs, a nervous, fluttering rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with academics. 6 p.m. on the dot, I knocked twice. Enter, her voice called out, muffled but instantly commanding. I pushed the door open. The office was bathed in the same warm amber light from the desk lamp, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the creeping dusk outside. Harper was seated behind her massive mahogany desk, surrounded by open textbooks and scattered files. The breath caught instantly in my throat. She had traded her structured blazer for a soft, dark charcoal turtleneck that clung to the elegant lines of her torso, making her look stark, striking, and impossibly beautiful. But it was the silver-rimmed reading glasses perched perfectly on the bridge of her nose that completely derailed my train of thought. They softened the severe, intimidating edge of her features, giving her an air of quiet, intense intellectualism that was devastatingly attractive. She didn't look up immediately. Her pen scratched across a document for 3 agonizing seconds before she capped it with a sharp click, removed her glasses, and finally lifted her stormy gray eyes to meet mine. You are punctual, Emma. I appreciate that, she said, her tone smooth and professional. She gestured to the heavy leather chair pulled up to the side of her desk. Sit. I crossed the room, the scent of bergamot and old paper washing over me, and sank into the chair. It was positioned much closer to her desk than a student's chair normally would be. There was a thick, pristine notebook and a silver pen waiting for me on the polished wood. I reviewed your initial exam paper this morning, Harper began without preamble, leaning back slightly and steepling her fingers. You did not fail because you do not understand the material. You failed because you memorized it. I frowned, the sting of academic pride rising up. Isn't that the point? Medical school is mostly memorization. If you want to be a mediocre doctor who can only treat textbook cases, yes, she countered smoothly, her gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room feel 10 degrees hotter. But you do not strike me as someone striving for mediocrity. Memorization fails when you are panicked. True understanding, the ability to synthesize, to see the architecture of the human body as a connected breathing system rather than a list of terms that survives panic. That is what we are going to build. She leaned forward, pulling a massive, terrifyingly complex diagram of the cranial nerves to the space between us. We begin tonight, she said, her voice dropping into that low, authoritative register that made a shiver run down my spine. You are going to walk me through the efferent pathways. And you are not going to look at your notes once. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Harper Vance relentlessly dismantled my brain. It was the most grueling, intensely demanding academic experience of my life. She didn't let a single hesitation slide. When I stumbled over a term, she didn't supply the answer. She stared at me with an unwavering, expectant calm until my brain, forced to bridge the gap, found the right pathway on its own. It was exhausting. It was exhilarating. It was also dangerously, distractingly intimate. Because we were sharing the same diagram, she frequently leaned over the desk to point to a specific structure. Every time she did, the proximity was paralyzing. I could feel the faint heat radiating from her body. I could see the stray, dark strands of hair that had escaped her usually flawless updo resting softly against the pale skin of her neck. At one point, my mind completely blanked on the vagus nerve. I stared at the diagram, the intricate lines blurring together as frustration started to mount. I bit my lower lip hard, my hands clenching in my lap. The old, familiar edge of panic threatened to rise in my chest. I lost it, I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut. I'm sorry. My brain just stopped. Breathe, Emma, Harper said quietly. I felt a sudden, cool pressure against my hand. I opened my eyes. Harper had reached across the desk and tapped 2 fingers against my knuckles. It wasn't the grounding, encompassing hold from the stairwell, but the brief, electrifying point of contact was enough to shock my system back online. You are overthinking the destination and losing the route, she murmured, her face mere inches from mine. The gray of her eyes was startlingly clear up close. Stop trying to give me the right answer. Look at the structure. Where does it have to go? I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes back to the paper, though my skin was still burning where she had touched me. The parasympathetic control, the heart, the lungs. Exactly, she breathed, the soft approval in her voice making my chest ache. You see? You know this. Stop doubting your own mind. She pulled back, the sudden loss of her proximity leaving me feeling incredibly unmoored. She glanced at the sleek silver watch on her wrist and let out a soft exhale. That is enough for tonight, she announced, closing the textbook with a definitive thud. You held your own far better than I anticipated for a first session. The foundation is solid. We just need to reinforce the load-bearing walls. I slumped back in my chair, completely drained but vibrating with a strange, dizzying high. I had survived. More than that, I had impressed her. Thank you, Dr. Vance, I said, my voice quiet in the dim room. Harper stood up, moving over to the side cabinet. She opened a small drawer and, to my absolute bewilderment, pulled out a foil-wrapped protein bar. She walked back and placed it on the desk directly in front of me. You are going to eat this on your walk back to your dormitory, she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. I looked from the protein bar up to her face. You keep snacks in your office? I keep provisions for entirely predictable emergencies, she corrected, her expression perfectly serious, though I swore I saw the faintest twitch of amusement at the corner of her mouth. You burned through a significant amount of glucose in the last 2 hours. If you pass out on the campus green, the dean will ask questions I have no desire to answer. Eat it. A laugh caught in my throat, breathless and entirely genuine. Yes, doctor. Harper went incredibly still. The faint, almost smile vanished from her lips, replaced by something much heavier. She looked at me, really looked at me, her gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to my eyes. The air in the office suddenly felt terrifyingly thin again, thick with a tension that had nothing to do with cranial nerves. Go home, Emma, she said softly, her voice carrying a strange, raw edge that I had never heard before. I stood up, my legs feeling a little unsteady. I picked up my backpack and the protein bar, painfully aware of her eyes tracking my every movement. I walked to the heavy oak door, but right as my hand closed over the brass handle, I couldn't stop myself. I turned back around. Harper was still standing by the desk, the amber light casting long, dramatic shadows across her face. She looked like a beautiful, lonely sentinel in a tower of books. I'll see you on Thursday, I said quietly. Harper's jaw tightened. She held my gaze, the storm in her eyes swirling dangerously. I will hold you to that, she murmured. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool, empty hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might bruise my ribs. The heavy lock clicked shut behind me, sealing her back inside, but as I walked out of the science building and into the dark campus night, I knew one terrifying, undeniable truth. Chloe was right. Surviving Dr. Vance's undivided attention was going to be the most dangerous thing I had ever done. End of Part 3. Part 4, the sympathetic nervous system. By Thursday afternoon, the sky over the campus had bruised into a violent, bruised purple. The air was thick, heavy, and humming with the specific kind of electric tension that always precedes a massive spring storm. Felt incredibly fitting. My entire nervous system had been vibrating at that exact same frequency for the past 48 hours. I had spent Wednesday practically entombed in the library, obsessively reviewing the cardiovascular system until the diagrams burned themselves into the back of my eyelids. I was determined not to falter in front of Harper again. I wanted to prove to her that her unprecedented gamble on me wasn't a mistake. But beneath the academic drive, there was a darker, more dangerous motivation that I barely dared to admit to myself. I wanted to see that flash of approval in her gray eyes again. I wanted to hear the soft, low murmur of her voice telling me I was right. I was halfway across the main quad when the sky finally broke open. It wasn't a gentle drizzle, it was a sudden, torrential downpour. Cold sheets of rain slammed into the pavement, instantly soaking through my thin denim jacket and plastering my hair to my face. I cursed violently, clutching my backpack to my chest to protect my textbooks, and sprinted the remaining 200 yards to the science building. When I finally pushed through the heavy glass doors of the faculty wing, I was a disaster. Water dripped steadily from the hem of my jeans, squeaking loudly on the polished linoleum floor. I checked my phone. 5:56 p.m. I didn't have time to go to the restrooms to dry off without being late, and Dr. Harper Vance had made her stance on punctuality exceptionally clear. I trudged up to the 4th floor, shivering as the aggressive air conditioning of the building hit my soaked clothes. I stopped in front of the heavy oak door, took a deep, shaky breath, and knocked twice. Enter. I pushed the door open. The office was exactly as I had left it on Tuesday, warm, amber-lit, and smelling of cedar and bergamot. Harper was seated at her desk, typing rapidly on her sleek silver laptop. She was wearing a perfectly tailored black silk blouse, the top 2 buttons undone, revealing the delicate hollow of her throat. She looked up, and whatever greeting she had prepared instantly died on her lips. Her fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. She stared at me, taking in my dripping hair, my soaked jacket, and the small puddle of water rapidly forming around my ruined sneakers on her pristine antique rug. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, my teeth chattering slightly. I forgot my umbrella, and the storm broke right as I was crossing the quad. "My books are dry, though." I protected the bag. Harper didn't say a word. She stood up with a fluid, lethal grace, her chair scraping softly against the floor. The storm raged outside, rain lashing violently against her large window, but the silence inside the office was absolute and heavy. She walked out from behind her desk, closing the distance between us with measured, deliberate steps. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen by the door as she stopped barely a foot away from me. Her gray eyes swept over my shivering frame, the storm in them darkening ominously. "Take the jacket off, Emma," she ordered, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a rough, commanding edge that made a fresh shiver run down my spine, one that had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. "It's fine, Dr. Vance. I'm just a little wet, I can still study." "Take it off," she repeated, stepping even closer. "Before you catch hypothermia and render this entire academic rescue mission entirely pointless." My fingers felt clumsy and numb as I fumbled with the buttons of the soaked denim. I peeled the heavy, wet jacket off my shoulders. Beneath it, I was wearing a simple, thin white t-shirt, which had regrettably also absorbed a significant amount of water. Clung to my skin, cold and uncomfortable. I crossed my arms defensively over my chest, suddenly acutely aware of how exposed I felt under her intense, unwavering gaze. Harper took the wet jacket from my hands without a word. She walked over to a small radiator near the window, draped it carefully over the metal coils to dry, and then moved to the tall mahogany wardrobe tucked in the corner of her office. She opened it, pulled out a thick, dark gray zip-up hoodie bearing the university's faculty crest, and walked back to me. She held it out. "Put this on." I stared at the sweatshirt. "That's yours." "I am aware of my own wardrobe inventory, Emma," she said dryly, though her eyes were incredibly intense. "Put it on. Your lips are turning blue, and I refuse to teach a student who is actively shivering. It is immensely distracting." I took the hoodie from her. The fabric was absurdly soft, heavy, and it smelled entirely of her, that intoxicating, sophisticated blend of bergamot, rain, and expensive ink. I slipped it over my head, instantly enveloped in warmth. It was far too big for me, the sleeves hanging past my fingertips, the hem reaching my mid-thigh. When I looked back up, Harper was watching me. Her jaw was tight, a tiny muscle feathering near her cheekbone. She looked at me wearing her clothes in her private office while the storm raged outside, and for 3 suspended seconds the heavy, invisible boundary between professor and student stretched until it was paper-thin, vibrating with unspoken tension. She broke the gaze first, clearing her throat softly and turning back to her desk. "Sit," she commanded, the brisk professionalism snapping back into place, though it sounded slightly forced. "Cardiovascular physiology tonight. I assume you reviewed the material?" "Yes," I said, taking my seat in the leather chair, pulling the oversized sleeves over my hands to hide their trembling. "Good." She leaned over the desk, pulling a blank sheet of paper toward her. She uncapped her silver fountain pen. "Walk me through the human body's physiological response to acute stress. The fight or flight mechanism. Detail the sympathetic nervous system's cascade." I swallowed hard. This I knew. But reciting it while sitting 3 feet away from the woman who currently had my own sympathetic nervous system in an absolute chokehold felt like a cruel irony. "The amygdala perceives a threat or a high-stress stimulus," I began, my voice steadying as the medical terminology anchored me. "It sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system by sending signals through the autonomic nerves to the adrenal glands." "And what do the adrenal glands do?" Harper murmured, her eyes dropping to my mouth as I spoke, the pen resting idle in her hand. "They pump epinephrine, adrenaline, into the bloodstream," I recited, my heart thumping heavily against my ribs. "The physiological changes are immediate." "List them for me," she whispered. "Heart rate accelerates," I said, my voice dropping slightly, the clinical words suddenly feeling incredibly intimate. "To push blood to the muscles, the heart, and other vital organs. Blood pressure rises. Airways in the lungs open wide so the lungs can take in as much oxygen as possible with each breath." "What else?" Harper leaned slightly closer, the amber light catching the silver rim of her glasses. I couldn't look away from her. "Pupils dilate. To let in more light and increase visual awareness. Senses become sharper. The body becomes completely hyper-focused on the source of the stimulus." "Exactly," Harper breathed, her gaze rising from my lips to lock onto my eyes. "The body abandons all secondary functions. Digestion, immune response, logical reasoning, they are all suppressed. The system becomes entirely consumed by a single overriding objective, survival. Or desire." The word hung in the air, heavy and electric. My breath hitched audibly in the quiet room. Did she just say desire? Textbooks certainly didn't list desire under the sympathetic cascade, but the biological mechanism was identical. The racing heart, the dilated pupils, the total consuming hyperfocus. I was experiencing it right now. I was completely paralyzed by her. A sudden, violently loud crack of thunder shattered the silence, rattling the large window panes. A split second later, the lights in the office flickered, buzzed aggressively, and completely died. We were plunged into sudden, heavy darkness. The only light left in the room came from the faint grayish glow of the storm outside and the small, pulsing green LED light on her laptop charger. The hum of the building's ventilation system groaned to a halt. "Stay where you are," Harper's voice came through the dark, instantly commanding and calm. The storm must have hit the main transformer. The emergency backup generators should engage in a few moments. I sat perfectly still, my fingers gripping the armrests of my chair. The darkness fundamentally changed the geography of the room. It stripped away the books, the desk, the academic armor. It left only the sound of the rain lashing against the glass, the heavy, rhythmic sound of my own breathing, and her. I heard the soft rustle of fabric. A moment later, a small, warm circle of light illuminated the desk between us. Harper had turned on her phone's flashlight, placing it face down on the glass to diffuse the harsh glare. The resulting light cast long, shifting shadows across her face, making her look dangerous, striking, and incredibly close. "Are you all right in the dark, Emma?" she asked quietly, her voice sounding different without the hum of the building to mask its softer edges. "I'm fine," I whispered. My voice betrayed me, trembling slightly. "Your heart rate is elevated," she noted. She wasn't looking at my notes. She was looking at the hollow of my throat, where my pulse was undoubtedly hammering a frantic, visible rhythm against my skin. The sympathetic nervous system at work. "It's just the thunder," I lied, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Is it?" Harper challenged softly. She shifted her chair, moving it slightly out from behind the barrier of the desk. She was close enough now that if I simply reached out my hand, I could touch her knee. "'Cause your pupils are dilated, Emma. And there is practically no light in this room to warrant it." The air felt so thick I could barely drag it into my lungs. The invisible line we had been dancing around for 2 days was suddenly right beneath my feet, waiting to be crossed. The exhaustion, the stress of the impending exam, the raw intimacy of wearing her clothes in the dark, it all culminated in a sudden, reckless surge of bravery. "Maybe the thunder isn't the stimulus," I breathed, holding her stormy, shadowed gaze. Harper went completely, absolutely rigid. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than the rain, heavier than the thunder. I watched the realization of what I had just said hit her. I watched the immaculate, untouchable professor warring with the woman who had knelt on a dirty stairwell floor just to help me breathe. Her hand twitched on the armrest of her chair. Her jaw clenched tight enough to snap bone. "Emma," she said. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a warning. Sounded ragged, torn from the very bottom of her chest. "Do not push a boundary you are not prepared to handle." "I'm not a child, Dr. Vance," I said, my voice shaking but resolute. "No," Harper agreed, her voice dropping into a dark, rough whisper that made my stomach plunge. She leaned forward, the small circle of light catching the dangerous intensity in her eyes. "You are my student. You are under my academic supervision. Your future rests entirely in my hands. Do you understand the sheer magnitude of the ethical line you are currently standing on?" "You sponsored my reset," I countered recklessly, unable to stop the words from spilling out. "You brought me to your private office. You gave me your clothes. You told me my body is reacting to you. Is that ethics or is that control?" Harper let out a sharp, harsh exhale, her eyes flashing with something entirely wild and uncontained. She closed the final few inches between us, leaning so close that I could feel the warm brush of her breath against my cheek. My eyes fluttered shut instinctively. "If I wanted control, Emma," she whispered, her lips mere inches from the shell of my ear, sending a blinding shockwave of heat straight down my spine, "you would not be sitting in that chair right now." Before I could even process the absolute devastation of that sentence, the heavy clunk of heavy machinery echoed from the basement. The emergency generators kicked in. The amber desk lamp flickered violently and roared back to life, flooding the room with sudden, blinding light. Harper snapped back in her chair with terrifying speed. The wildness vanished from her face in an instant, instantly replaced by the cold, flawless marble mask of the faculty's most feared professor. She reached out, switched off her phone flashlight, and picked up her silver fountain pen with a perfectly steady hand. I sat there, utterly paralyzed, my chest heaving, feeling as though I had just been dragged back from the edge of a towering cliff. As we were discussing, Harper said smoothly, though a faint, dark flush lingered high on her cheekbones, the cardiovascular response must be entirely regulated before true healing can begin. We will review the parasympathetic system next. I stared at her, my blood still roaring in my ears, knowing with terrifying certainty that neither of us was ever going to be able to regulate this. End of Part 4. Part 5. The sensory pathways. The blinding glare of the amber desk lamp felt like a physical blow. The sudden return of electricity brought the low, mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system back with it, instantly shattering the heavy, suffocating silence that had enveloped us. Dr. Harper Vance was a masterclass in compartmentalization. In the span of a single heartbeat, she had retreated from the dangerous, whispering woman who had practically promised my ruin in the dark, back into the impenetrable fortress of the faculty's most demanding academic. Her posture was razor straight. Her silver fountain pen was poised perfectly over a pristine legal pad. The parasympathetic nervous system, Harper said, her voice sharp and flawlessly modulated, though a faint telltale flush still clung to the sharp cut of her cheekbones. Often referred to as the rest and digest state, functions in direct opposition to the sympathetic cascade we just discussed. Tell me how it achieves homeostasis, Emma. I sat in the leather chair, my chest still heaving, my mind entirely scrambled. My body was still trapped in the fight-or-flight response, adrenaline surging violently through my veins, and she was calmly asking me to recite the biological mechanics of calming down. It was a spectacular, almost cruel irony. I swallowed hard, my throat incredibly dry. My fingers gripped the armrests so tightly my knuckles were stark white. The vagus nerve. It acts as the primary conduit. Go on, Harper commanded, not looking up from her notepad. Her refusal to meet my eyes was the only crack in her armor, the only proof that the last 5 minutes hadn't been a fever dream. It releases acetylcholine, I stammered, forcing my brain to sift through the medical textbooks while my skin still burned from the ghost of her breath against my cheek. Which binds to muscarinic receptors. Decelerates the heart rate. It lowers blood pressure. It commands the body to stand down. Correct, Harper said smoothly. She capped her pen with a definitive ringing click that echoed in the quiet office. It commands the body to stand down when the perceived threat or stimulus is no longer present. A necessary biological intervention to prevent the system from burning itself out. She finally looked up. Her stormy gray eyes were completely unreadable, a sheet of ice frozen over a turbulent ocean. We are done for this evening, she announced, her tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You have grasped the autonomic pathways adequately. Spend the weekend reviewing the somatosensory system. I expect you to be flawless by Tuesday. She was dismissing me. She was throwing the emergency brake on the evening because the alternative was acknowledging what had almost happened in the dark. I wanted to push back. The reckless, adrenaline-fueled part of me wanted to ask her why her own breathing was still shallow, why she was gripping her silver pen so tightly her knuckles mirrored mine. But the absolute authority radiating from her desk was a high, impenetrable wall. I had pushed the boundary as far as I could tonight without shattering my academic future entirely. Yes, Dr. Vance, I said quietly. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely hollow. I gathered my textbooks, acutely aware of the oversized gray faculty hoodie that swallowed my frame. Her hoodie still wrapping me in the intoxicating scent of bergamot and cedar. She didn't ask for it back. She didn't look at me as I walked to the heavy oak door. Emma, her voice caught me right as my hand found the brass handle. I froze, my pulse instantly accelerating all over again. I looked back over my shoulder. Harper was still seated behind her desk, the amber light casting a stark shadow over half her face. Do not let the adrenaline of tonight distract you from your ultimate objective, she said, her voice low, carrying a strange, heavy undercurrent. The reset exam is the only thing that matters. Do you understand me? It wasn't a reminder to study. It was a desperate, unyielding warning to both of us. "I understand," I whispered. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the frigid, brightly lit hallway, leaving her alone in the storm. The weekend was absolute agony. I spent Saturday and Sunday practically barricaded in my dorm room, surrounded by towering stacks of neuroanatomy textbooks, trying to force the intricate maps of the human nervous system into my brain. But every time I closed my eyes, I didn't see diagrams of the spinal cord. I saw the dangerous, uncontained flash in Harper's eyes. I heard the rough, breathy drop of her voice telling me that if she wanted control, I wouldn't be sitting in that chair. Chloe noticed my distraction, of course. She watched me stare blankly at a wall for 20 minutes on Sunday afternoon, tapping a highlighter aggressively against my desk. "Okay, what is going on with you?" Chloe demanded, tossing a throw pillow at my head. "You have been vibrating at a frequency that is going to shatter the windows. And why are you wearing a faculty hoodie that looks like it costs more than my entire tuition?" I caught the pillow, my face burning. I hadn't taken Harper's sweatshirt off since Thursday night. It was pathetic, but the heavy fabric felt like a physical anchor when my mind was completely unmoored. "It's just the reset," I lied smoothly, burying my face in a textbook on tactile sensory pathways. "The pressure is getting to me." "I'm fine." By the time Tuesday evening finally arrived, the tension inside my chest had coiled so tightly I felt like I might snap in half. I had washed Harper's hoodie, dried it on the delicate cycle, and folded it meticulously into my backpack. I wore a conservative, pale blue button-down shirt and black trousers, actively trying to look as professional and detached as humanly possible. I needed to prove to her that I could handle the academic pressure without crossing the line. At exactly 6 p.m., I knocked on the heavy oak door on the 4th floor. "Enter." The office was unchanged. The amber lamp, the smell of old paper, the terrifyingly beautiful woman seated behind the mahogany desk. Harper was wearing a fitted navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her hair pulled back into its severe signature clasp. She looked rested, composed, and absolutely untouchable. The wildness of Thursday night had been completely erased. "Good evening, Emma," she said briskly, not a trace of warmth in her tone. "Sit down." Somatosensory pathways. "I expect you are prepared." "I am," I said, taking my seat in the leather chair. I unzipped my backpack, pulled out the neatly folded gray hoodie, and set it carefully on the edge of her desk. "Thank you for letting me borrow this. It's been washed." Harper looked at the folded fabric for a long, silent moment. A tiny muscle feathered along her jawline. She reached out and pulled the hoodie onto her side of the desk, her long, elegant fingers brushing briefly against the cotton. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice slightly tighter than before. She immediately picked up her silver fountain pen, redirecting her focus with ruthless efficiency. "Let us begin. The brain's processing of tactile stimuli. How does a physical sensation on the periphery of the body translate into conscious recognition in the cerebral cortex?" I took a deep breath, grounding myself in the science. "It travels through the dorsal columedial lemniscus pathway. Receptors in the skin, like mechanoreceptors, detect the physical change. They send an electrical impulse up the first-order neurons into the spinal cord." "Adequate," Harper interrupted smoothly, standing up from her chair. My words faltered as she walked around the desk. Usually she stayed behind it, maintaining that physical wooden barrier between us. Tonight she stepped directly into my space. She leaned her hip against the edge of the desk right next to my chair, looking down at me with an intense, clinical gaze. "Words on a page are merely theory, Emma," she said, her voice dropping into a low instructional cadence. "Medicine is physical. It is tactile. Give me your hand." My heart instantly slammed against my ribs. "My hand. Your hand, Emma. For a practical demonstration." She held out her own hand, her palm open, demanding and absolute. Swallowing past the sudden dryness in my throat, I slowly lifted my right hand. Harper's fingers wrapped around my wrist. Her touch was firm, cool, and undeniably electric. She pulled my hand forward, turning it palm up, resting my forearm gently against her knee as she leaned against the desk. Proximity was devastating. I could smell the bergamot radiating from her skin. I could see the exact, perfect line of her profile as she looked down at my palm. "Mechanoreceptors," Harper murmured, uncapping her silver pen with her free hand. She used the smooth, rounded metal end of the cap, not the ink point. Specifically, Meissner's corpuscles located just beneath the epidermis. She dragged the smooth metal cap lightly across the sensitive skin of my palm. A violent shiver racked my entire body. Contrast between her cold, clinical tone and the burning sensation of her touch was maddening. "They respond to light touch and low-frequency vibration," she continued, her thumb pressing softly against the inside of my wrist, right over my hammering pulse. "The impulse fires. Travels up your arm. Where does it decussate? Where does it cross over to the other side of the nervous system?" The medulla," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't look at the diagram on the desk. I could only look at her mouth, at the way her lips moved around the medical terms. "Correct." Harper dragged the pen cap in a slow, agonizingly deliberate line up my inner forearm. "And Pacinian corpuscles? What is their function?" "Deep pressure," I choked out, my eyes fluttering shut as the metal cap dug slightly firmer into the skin just below the crook of my elbow. "And high-frequency vibration." "Deep pressure," she repeated softly. Her thumb pressed harder against my racing pulse, entirely anchoring me to her. "You feel the pressure now. Your brain is mapping the exact location of the stimulus. It is sending the signal to the thalamus and then to the primary somatosensory cortex. But the physiological response, the accelerated heart rate, the shallow breathing, that is not purely tactile. That is emotional processing in the limbic system." She stopped moving the pen, but she didn't let go of my wrist. Her fingers were a vice of warmth and authority. "Tell me, Emma," Harper whispered, leaning down so close that her breath fluttered against my eyelashes. "What is your limbic system telling you right now?" The academic charade was completely shattered. There was no theory left. There was only the heavy, suffocating weight of her gaze, the burning touch of her hand on my skin, and the terrifying realization that she wasn't just testing my knowledge anymore. She was testing my endurance. I opened my eyes, meeting her stormy gray gaze with a sudden, desperate kind of bravery. "It's telling me," I whispered, my voice trembling but unbroken, "that you are trying to prove you have complete control over my responses. And it's telling me that you're doing it because you are terrified of your own." Harper went dangerously still. The silver pen slipped slightly in her grip. For a second, the brilliant, terrifying Dr. Vance looked entirely, beautifully unraveled. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Blood-Brain Barrier. The silence that followed my words was not empty. It was a heavy, vibrating entity, thick enough to suffocate on. Felt as though the oxygen had been entirely vacuumed from the room, leaving only the frantic, hammering rhythm of my own pulse and the absolute stillness of Dr. Harper Vance. For a long, agonizing second, neither of us moved. My wrist was still securely trapped in her grip, her thumb resting directly over the frantic thumping of my artery. Her face was inches from mine, close enough that I could see the tiny, imperceptible widening of her pupils, the very biological response we had been clinically analyzing just moments ago. Then, the silver fountain pen clattered onto the mahogany desk. The sharp, metallic sound broke the spell. Harper released my wrist as though she had been burned. She stepped back, the sudden, violent movement putting a safe, professional distance between us. The loss of her touch was immediate and chilling. The skin of my forearm felt entirely bereft, buzzing with a phantom heat. Harper did not look at me. She turned away, walking over to the large window overlooking the darkened campus. She stood with her back to me, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. "You have a profoundly dangerous habit, Emma," she said, her voice stripped of its usual smooth cadence. It was a low, rough murmur that seemed to scrape against the glass. You confuse clinical observation with psychological projection. I wasn't projecting, I said. My voice shook, but the reckless bravery that had overtaken me refused to completely recede. You know I wasn't. Harper's shoulders tensed beneath the immaculate fabric of her navy blazer. For a long time, she simply watched the scattered campus lights cutting through the darkness outside. When she finally turned back to face me, the storm in her gray eyes had been locked away behind a thick, impenetrable wall of ice. The terrifyingly beautiful, vulnerable woman from a moment ago was gone, entirely replaced by the formidable head of neurological studies. The somatosensory system is a closed loop, Harper stated, her tone brisk, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. She walked back to her desk, not sitting down but leaning over to neatly align her scattered papers. It receives a stimulus, it processes the data, and it moves on. I highly suggest you learn to do the same. We are done for tonight. It was a dismissal, sharp and final. I wanted to argue. I wanted to stand up and demand she acknowledge the electric, unspoken thing currently tearing the air between us to shreds. But the absolute authority radiating from her was a physical barrier. I had struck a nerve, a deep one, and the resulting defensive wall was too high to climb. Yes, Dr. Vance, I whispered. I gathered my textbooks, my hands trembling so violently I nearly dropped my neuroanatomy binder. I shoved everything into my backpack and practically fled the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me with a resounding, undeniable finality. The next 10 days were an absolute blur of academic torture and emotional starvation. The reset exam was looming on the horizon, a massive, terrifying monolith that dictated every waking hour of my life. I studied until the words blurred on the pages, until the anatomical diagrams haunted my restless, fragmented sleep. Chloe watched me descend back into my frantic, hyper-focused state, but she didn't intervene. She could see that it was different this time. It wasn't just the fear of losing my scholarship driving me. It was the terrifying, desperate need to prove myself to the woman who was currently dismantling my sanity piece by piece. Our Tuesday and Thursday sessions continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally fractured. Harper was ruthless. She pushed me harder than I had ever been pushed in my entire academic career. The questions she fired at me were relentless, obscure, and blisteringly difficult. She maintained a strict, physical distance, never stepping out from behind her massive mahogany desk, never allowing the conversation to stray even a millimeter away from the curriculum. It was a punishment. I knew it, and she knew it. She was punishing me for seeing through her armor, and she was punishing herself for allowing the armor to slip in the first place. By the time the second Thursday of the month rolled around 2 weeks before the exam, I was operating on sheer, brittle fumes. I walked into her office at 6 p.m., the familiar scent of bergamot and old paper hitting me like a physical blow. The amber desk lamp was on, casting long shadows across the room. Harper was seated behind her desk, wearing a stark charcoal gray suit, looking every inch the untouchable academic monarch. "Take a seat, Emma," she commanded immediately, not looking up from a file she was annotating. "Tonight we are bridging pharmacology with neuroanatomy, specifically the blood-brain barrier. I expect you to be flawless." I sank into the leather chair, dropping my heavy backpack onto the floor with a dull thud. My head was pounding, a dull, rhythmic ache settling directly behind my left eye. "The blood-brain barrier," Harper began, capping her pen and finally fixing her piercing gray gaze on me. "A highly selective, semi-permeable border. Separates the circulating blood from the brain and extracellular fluid in the central nervous system. Tell me how it achieves this selectivity, and detail the specific lipid-soluble molecules that can bypass it." I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to force my exhausted brain to access the file. It's formed by endothelial cells of the capillary wall. They are connected by tight junctions. Extremely tight. Be specific, Emma. Generalizations are for undergraduates, Harper snapped. The harshness of her tone made my jaw clench. Astrocytes. Astrocytic end feet encircle the endothelial cells, providing biochemical support. It restricts the diffusion of microscopic objects like bacteria and large or hydrophilic molecules into the cerebrospinal fluid. And the molecules that bypass it? She pressed, her voice sharp as a scalpel. Lipid-soluble molecules, like oxygen, carbon dioxide, hormones. I rubbed my temple, the headache escalating from a dull throb to a sharp spike of pain. And certain drugs, like barbiturates. What about glucose? Harper fired back instantly, leaning forward. The brain requires a massive amount of energy. Glucose is entirely hydrophilic. How does it cross the barrier? My mind blanked. The information was there, buried under layers of exhaustion, adrenaline, and the overwhelming distraction of her presence, but I couldn't reach it. I stared at her, the silence stretching out in the quiet office. I swallowed hard. It diffuses. Wrong, Harper said sharply. The word hit the air like a whip. Diffusion is passive. A hydrophilic molecule cannot passively diffuse across a lipid bilayer. Think, Emma. Do not just guess. The human brain consumes 20% of the body's energy. How does the fuel arrive? I don't remember, I whispered, the frustration rising in my chest like a hot tide. You do not remember, Harper repeated, her tone dripping with a cold, terrifying disappointment. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. You are 2 weeks away from an exam that dictates the entire trajectory of your life, and you do not remember the basic metabolic pathway of the central nervous system. You are letting your exhaustion dictate your logic. A fatal flaw in a medical professional. The reprimand shattered the last, fragile tether holding my composure together. I am letting my exhaustion dictate my logic because I am exhausted. I snapped, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. Harper's eyes widened fractionally. I had never raised my voice at her. No student ever did. I have spent the last 3 weeks doing nothing but studying, sleeping, and trying to decipher the impossible standard you keep setting for me. I pushed myself up from the leather chair, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I braced them against the edge of her desk. You keep moving the finish line, Dr. Vance. No matter what I answer, no matter how hard I push, you find a way to tell me it isn't enough. You aren't tutoring me anymore. You're just trying to break me down. Emma, Harper said, her voice dangerously low, a dark warning vibrating in the syllables. No. I shot back, the raw, unfiltered truth pouring out of me. You told me to stop projecting, but this is exactly what this is. You're angry about what happened last week. You're angry that you let your guard down, and now you're punishing me for it by turning this into a firing squad. Harper stood up so fast her heavy leather chair slammed into the bookshelf behind her. The sudden violent sound shocked me into silence. She stood behind the desk, her chest heaving, the pristine, untouchable facade completely and utterly destroyed. The storm in her gray eyes was no longer cold. It was a wild, incandescent fury. For a terrifying moment, I thought she was going to throw me out. I thought she was going to march over to the door, open it, and tell me that my reset was canceled, my scholarship was gone, and my presence in her program was officially terminated. Instead, she closed her eyes, taking a long, ragged inhale that sounded entirely broken. When she opened them again, the anger had drained away, leaving behind a raw, naked vulnerability that hit me harder than any reprimand ever could. Glucose crosses the barrier via specific transport proteins. Specifically, the GLUT1 transporter, Harper said. Her voice was barely a whisper, thick and unsteady. She walked slowly around the desk, stopping mere inches from where I was standing. Proximity was overwhelming. I could see the dark shadows under her own eyes, the absolute exhaustion radiating from her posture. I am not trying to break you, Emma, she murmured, looking down at my white-knuckled grip on the edge of the mahogany desk. I am pushing you because the medical board will push you harder. I am pushing you because I know you are capable of surviving it. She slowly reached out. My breath hitched, expecting her to grab my wrist again, to offer another clinical demonstration of my own weakness. but her hand bypassed my arm entirely. Her cool, elegant fingers brushed gently against the side of my face, her thumb coming to rest lightly against my left temple, right where the headache had been relentlessly spiking. "You have a tension headache," Harper whispered, her thumb beginning to trace slow, incredibly soothing circles against my skin. "Left hemisphere. Radiating from the optical nerve due to severe eye strain and lack of adequate hydration." I closed my eyes, a pathetic, broken sigh escaping my lips as the pressure of her touch instantly began to dissolve the pain. "Harper." The sound of her first name slipping from my mouth made her hand freeze. It was the ultimate crossing of the boundary, a verbal transgression that stripped away the entire academic hierarchy separating us. But she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, the heat of her body radiating through the thin fabric of my shirt. Her other hand came up, resting tentatively on my waist, a hesitant, grounding touch that felt like an anchor in a storm. "I am punishing you," Harper confessed, her voice a ragged, devastated whisper against the quiet hum of the office. "You were right. I am punishing you because every time you walk into this room, every time you look at me with that brilliant, stubborn mind, I lose another piece of my objectivity. And it terrifies me." I opened my eyes, looking up into the stormy depths of her gaze. There was no desk between us now. No textbooks. No clinical terminology to hide behind. There was only the heavy, electric truth vibrating in the air between us, impossible to ignore any longer. "Then stop trying to be objective," I breathed, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her palm. Harper's eyes dropped to my mouth, the silver control finally, beautifully shattering. End of Part 6. Part 7, The Action Potential. The words hung in the space between us, reckless and irrevocable. "Stop trying to be objective." For a fraction of a second, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The low hum of the ventilation system, the faint patter of rain against the glass, the frantic beating of my own heart, it all faded into a heavy, suspended vacuum. I watched the last fragile thread of Dr. Harper Vance's legendary self-control pull taut, fray at the edges and violently snap. She didn't hesitate. She didn't offer another warning. Harper's hand slid from my temple, her long, elegant fingers threading deep into the hair at the nape of my neck. She gripped me with a possessive, grounding force that sent a shockwave of heat straight to the soles of my feet, and she pulled me in. When her mouth finally met mine, it wasn't a gentle, tentative exploration. It was a collision. A startled gasp escaped my throat, swallowed instantly by the desperate, consuming pressure of her lips. Kiss was devastating. It was months of suppressed academic tension, grueling late-night studying, and unspoken, agonizing longing breaking open all at once. Harper tasted like chamomile tea, mint, and the sharp, intoxicating essence of bergamot. My hands, acting entirely on their own desperate instinct, flew up to grip the lapels of her immaculate charcoal gray suit jacket. I held on to her as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath us, pulling her closer, erasing the last fraction of an inch between our bodies. Harper groaned softly, a dark, ragged sound that vibrated directly against my lips and sent a liquid heat pooling low in my stomach. Her free hand wrapped firmly around my waist, pulling me flush against the edge of the mahogany desk. I was entirely caged in by her, by the desk behind me, and the overwhelming, brilliant force of her in front of me. She kissed me like she was starving, like I was the only oxygen left in the room. Clinical, terrifying professor was entirely gone, replaced by a woman unraveling so beautifully in my arms that it made my chest physically ache. Her mouth was demanding, coaxing my lips apart, deepening the kiss until my knees actually buckled. If she hadn't been holding me so securely, I would have collapsed onto the antique rug. "Harper," I breathed against her mouth, the name slipping out again like a prayer. The sound of her name on my tongue seemed to drive her completely over the edge. Her grip in my hair tightened slightly, angling my head to grant her deeper access. I surrendered completely, my fingers sliding off her lapels to wrap tightly around her neck, anchoring myself to the solid, warm reality of her body. Every nerve ending I possessed was firing at maximum capacity, a blinding cascade of sensory overload that no textbook could ever adequately describe. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, lost in the dark amber-lit bubble of her office, defying every rule, every boundary, every ethical code she had built her life around. But biology demands equilibrium. Slowly, agonizingly, the desperate hunger of the kiss began to taper off into something softer, sweeter, but infinitely more heartbreaking. Harper's lips moved gently against mine one last, lingering time before she slowly pulled back. She didn't let me go. Her forehead dropped to rest heavily against mine. We were both breathing incredibly hard, our chests heaving in tandem in the quiet room. Close, with her eyes closed and her flawless composure entirely shattered, she looked impossibly young and terrifyingly vulnerable. "This is absolute madness," Harper whispered, her voice rough and trembling, a stark contrast to her usual commanding tone. "I don't care," I answered immediately, my hands still locked behind her neck, terrified that if I let go, she would vanish back behind her walls. Harper let out a broken, breathless laugh, opening her eyes. The stormy gray was completely dilated, dark and swirling with an emotion so intense it made my throat tighten. "I know you don't. That is exactly why I have to care enough for the both of us." She slowly unwrapped my arms from her neck, her fingers trailing down my arms to gently grip my wrists. She took a step back, putting a few inches of agonizing, necessary space between us. Cold air of the office rushed in to fill the gap, and I shivered instantly. "Emma, listen to me," Harper said. She was fighting visibly to rebuild the walls, her jaw tight, but she didn't let go of my hands. "If the ethics committee finds out about this, it is not just a scandal. It is the end of my tenure, and more importantly, it is the immediate revocation of your academic standing. They will expel you." The harsh reality of her words crashed down on me like a bucket of ice water. The euphoric, adrenaline-fueled haze evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, terrifying clarity. "Nobody has to know. I am the faculty sponsor of your reset exam," Harper continued, her voice steadying, adopting a fierce, protective edge. "I am grading your paper. I am fighting the dean for your scholarship. If there is even a whisper of impropriety, they will invalidate your exam. All of your work, everything you have sacrificed, will be for absolutely nothing." I looked down at our joined hands, the fear finally cutting through the desire. She was right. She was absolutely right, and it was entirely unfair. "So what does this mean? We just pretend this didn't happen?" "No." The word was sharp, immediate, and completely unyielding. I snapped my head up to look at her. Harper reached up and cupped my cheek, her thumb brushing softly over my cheekbone. "I am not taking this back, Emma. I am not pretending that I do not want you. But I am not going to be the reason you lose your future." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute terrifying conviction. "You have 14 days until the reset," Harper stated, her voice dropping into a low, deadly serious register. "For the next 14 days, I am Dr. Vance. You are my student. When you are in this office, there will be a desk between us. We will study the curriculum, and we will not cross this line again. You will sleep, you will hydrate, and you will walk into that exam hall and write a flawless paper." My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "And after the exam?" A dark, incredibly dangerous promise flashed in Harper's gray eyes. "After the exam, the papers are submitted for blind grading. You will officially complete the module, and you will no longer be under my direct academic supervision." She leaned in, her lips hovering mere millimeters from my ear, her warm breath sending a violent shiver cascading down my spine. "Pass this exam, Emma," she whispered, her voice a rough, intoxicating command that commanded absolute obedience. "Survive these next 14 days. Prove to the board that you belong here. And the absolute second you walk out of that examination hall, all of the rules are gone. The air in my lungs vanished." She pulled back, her eyes burning into mine, searching for my understanding. I nodded slowly, my pulse roaring in my ears. I wasn't just fighting for a scholarship anymore. I wasn't just fighting for my mother's pride back in Ohio. I was fighting for the woman standing in front of me. 14 days, I agreed, my voice trembling but laced with absolute resolve. Harper's expression softened into a look of such profound, devastating pride that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. She let go of my hands, stepping back behind the heavy mahogany desk. She straightened her suit jacket, cleared her throat, and picked up her silver fountain pen. The physical transition was jarring, but the emotional shift was undeniable. Tension in the room was no longer a toxic, heavy weight. It was a live wire, humming with anticipation and a shared, secret promise. "Now," Dr. Vance said, her voice crisp and clear, the authoritative professor returning to her throne. "Let us return to the metabolic pathways of the central nervous system. How does the GLUT1 transporter function under physiological stress?" I sat back down in the leather chair. The headache that had been blinding me just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a sharp, crystalline focus. For the next 2 hours, we studied. We mapped the brain, we recited pharmacology, we broke down the exact physiological responses of the human body. Harper was just as demanding, just as exacting as she had always been. She didn't let a single hesitation slide. But every time I answered correctly, every time I bridged a complex connection, her eyes would catch the amber light, flashing with a quiet, burning pride that fueled me better than any caffeine ever could. When the clock on her wall finally struck 8:30 p.m., she closed her notebook. "We are done for the evening," she announced. "Your grasp on the material is stabilizing. Do not neglect your rest this weekend." I packed my bag, slinging it over my shoulder. I walked to the door, feeling lighter than I had in months. I turned back one last time. Harper was watching me, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "Good night, Dr. Vance," I said, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corner of my lips. Harper's eyes darkened, the corner of her own mouth twitching into a micro-expression that was undeniably a smirk. "Good night, Emma," she replied smoothly. 13 days. I walked out of the science building and into the cool, damp night air. The storm had passed, leaving the campus smelling of wet earth and ozone. As I walked back to my dorm, my steps felt grounded, sure, and completely unstoppable. The house of cards I had built my life upon had collapsed, yes. But Dr. Harper Vance hadn't just caught me before I hit the ground. She had handed me the blueprints to build something entirely unbreakable. And in exactly 13 days, I was going to claim my reward. End of Part 7. Part 8, The Blind Protocol. The next 13 days were a masterclass in psychological endurance. If anyone had asked me how I survived that 2-week purgatory, I wouldn't have been able to give them a coherent answer. I existed in a state of suspended animation, moving between the library, my dorm room, and the 4th floor of the science building like a ghost haunting my own life. Chloe noticed the shift immediately. The frantic, weeping, over-caffeinated mess I had been at the start of the semester was entirely gone. In her place was a dangerously calm, hyper-focused machine. I didn't complain about the workload. I didn't stress-eat stale library vending machine snacks. I drank water, I slept for exactly 7 hours a night, and I studied with a brutal, systematic efficiency that actually began to frighten my roommate. "It's like watching a Navy SEAL prepare for deployment," Chloe muttered one evening, watching me meticulously color-code a massive diagram of the cranial nerves without breaking a sweat. "I am simultaneously incredibly proud of you and deeply terrified for your soul." I just smiled, a small, tight curve of my lips, and kept drawing. What Chloe didn't know, what no one could know, was that my discipline had absolutely nothing to do with standard academic motivation. It was fueled entirely by the woman waiting for me on the 4th floor every Tuesday and Thursday evening. Those private sessions with Dr. Harper Vance became a beautiful, agonizing torture. True to her word, Harper rebuilt the walls of Jericho around her desk. When I walked into her office, she was the epitome of the untouchable, exacting head of neurological studies. She wore structured blazers that buttoned up to her collarbone. She kept her hair pinned back so severely that not a single dark strand escaped. and she never, under any circumstances, closed the physical distance between us. But the tension in that room was a living, breathing entity. It was in the way her gray eyes tracked the movement of my throat when I swallowed nervously over a complex pharmacology question. It was in the heavy, loaded silence that fell over the office when I correctly mapped the parasympathetic cascade without a single stammer. It was in the way she gripped her silver fountain pen so tightly her knuckles turned stark white, simply because I leaned across the desk to point at a diagram, bringing the scent of my shampoo into her personal space. We were playing a high-stakes game of academic roulette. Every correct answer was a step closer to the finish line. Every lingering look was a reminder of what awaited us on the other side. 4 days, Harper had murmured at the end of our final Thursday session, her voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that made my toes curl in my shoes. She hadn't looked up from her grading ledger, but the dark flush on her high cheekbones betrayed her. "I'm ready," I had whispered back. And I was. When the morning of the reset exam finally dawned, the sky over the campus was a sharp, brilliant blue, completely stripped of the heavy, bruised storm clouds that had defined the past month. I woke up before my alarm, feeling strangely calm. The crippling, suffocating panic that had paralyzed me during the first exam was entirely absent. In its place was a cold, crystalline certainty. I dressed carefully, choosing a crisp white blouse and dark trousers, armor for the battlefield. The examination hall was located in the basement of the old medical annex, a sterile, aggressively fluorescent-lit room that smelled of industrial bleach and anxiety. 'Cause this was a special administrative reset, I was the only student taking the paper. The invigilator was a bored-looking graduate assistant who didn't even look up from her phone as she handed me the thick, sealed exam booklet. 2 hours, the grad assistant mumbled, clicking a stopwatch. Begin. I broke the seal on the booklet and flipped to the first page. For a fraction of a second, the old ghost of panic fluttered in my chest. The dense, microscopic text blurred slightly. The hum of the fluorescent lights roared in my ears. But then I closed my eyes. I didn't think about my mother's pride. I didn't think about the scholarship review board. I felt the phantom weight of a warm, elegant hand pressing down firmly on my knee. I heard the low, melodic, commanding voice cutting through the dark. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Focus entirely on the concrete beneath you and the sound of my voice. I took a deep, measured breath, effectively shutting down the sympathetic cascade before it could even begin. My heart rate leveled out. The adrenaline receded, leaving behind pure, unadulterated focus. I opened my eyes, uncapped my pen, and went to war. The exam was brutal, deliberately designed to weed out anyone who had merely memorized the textbook without understanding the architecture of the human body. But for every impossibly complex scenario the paper threw at me, Harper had already drilled me harder. Question 4. Detail the decussation pathways of the dorsal column medial lemniscus system. I felt the ghost of a smooth metal pen cap dragging up my inner forearm. I wrote the answer flawlessly. Question 9. Explain the physiological limitations of the GLUT1 transporter during hypoglycemic shock. I saw the wild, incandescent fury in storm gray eyes, heard the broken whisper confessing that her objectivity was entirely gone. I filled an entire page with the metabolic breakdown, my handwriting sharp and unyielding. I didn't just pass the paper. I dismantled it. I tore it down to its microscopic foundations and rebuilt it exactly the way Dr. Harper Vance had taught me to. When the grad assistant called time, I put my pen down. My fingers were cramped, smeared with black ink, and my neck was stiff, but the overwhelming surge of euphoria crashing through my veins was intoxicating. I handed the booklet over, grabbed my backpack, and practically floated out of the basement. The second the heavy doors of the medical annex closed behind me, I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were shaking, not from panic, but from a massive, overwhelming adrenaline dump. The grading protocol was blind. Paper would be assigned a barcode, scanned into the system, and graded anonymously by 2 different faculty members to ensure absolute impartiality. I wouldn't have the official results for 48 hours. But the academic supervision clause was fundamentally clear. The absolute second the paper left my hands and entered the registrar's lockbox, the module was over. I was no longer an active candidate in Dr. Vance's curriculum until the following semester. The ethical boundary had just dissolved into thin air. I unlocked my screen, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard, debating whether I was brave enough to send the text. Before I could even open my Messages app, the phone vibrated violently in my palm. Text illuminated the screen. It was from a private number I had memorized weeks ago, though I had never dared to use it. "Did you submit the paper?" HV. My breath hitched. I typed back so fast I nearly dropped the device. "Yes, it's done. I destroyed it." The 3 little typing dots appeared immediately, hovering for a long, agonizing moment before the reply came through. "The blind grading protocol has officially commenced. You are no longer under my academic supervision. Come to my office. Now." I didn't walk across the campus quad, I ran. I ignored the strange looks from passing undergraduates. I ignored the heavy burn in my lungs and the fact that my pristine white blouse was clinging to my skin from the sudden exertion. I burst through the front doors of the science building, bypassed the painfully slow elevator, and took the stairs to the 4th floor 2 at a time. By the time I reached the heavy oak door with her name frosted on the glass, I was completely breathless. Corridor was empty. The faculty wing was dead silent. I didn't knock. I grabbed the brass handle, pushed the door open, and stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. The heavy lock clicked into place with a resounding, final echo. The office was bathed in the familiar amber light of the desk lamp, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the bright afternoon sun outside. Harper was standing on the opposite side of the room, near the tall mahogany bookshelves. She wasn't wearing her blazer. She was in a simple dark silk blouse, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the silver watch on her wrist gleaming in the dim light. When she heard the door click shut, she turned to face me. All the air rushed out of the room. For 14 days, I had looked at this woman through the rigid, suffocating lens of academic hierarchy. I had seen the professor, the mentor, the untouchable genius who held my future in the palm of her hand. But looking at her now, with the exam officially submitted and the heavy weight of the ethics board lifted from our shoulders, the shift was absolute and entirely devastating. She wasn't my professor anymore. She was just Harper. Her gray eyes swept over my flushed face, my heaving chest, and the ink smudged across my fingertips. The severe, controlled mask she had worn for 2 weeks shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The storm in her gaze wasn't cold. It was a dark, consuming wildfire. "You passed," she breathed, her voice a low, rough rasp that sent a violent shiver straight down my spine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of absolute, unwavering faith. "I passed," I confirmed, stepping away from the door and moving slowly into the room. The somatosensory question. The metabolic pathways. Everything you drilled into me. I knew it all. Harper uncrossed her arms. Her hands fell to her sides, her fingers twitching slightly. "The registrar sent the confirmation email 30 seconds before you walked through that door. Your barcode is logged. The paper is secured in the blind grading queue." I stopped directly in front of her massive mahogany desk. The wooden barrier was still between us, the final remnant of the world we had just burned down. "Does that mean the rules are gone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain she could hear it. Harper stared at me, her chest rising and falling in a ragged, uneven rhythm. The tension radiating off her body was palpable, a physical heat that reached across the wood to scorch my skin. "Emma," she warned, the last dying breath of her restraint trembling in her throat. "If you cross to this side of the desk right now, there is absolutely no going back. I will not be able to stop myself again." I didn't even hesitate. I walked around the edge of the mahogany desk, stepping directly into her space. I stopped inches from her chest, looking up into the beautiful, terrified, entirely undone face of the coldest woman on campus. I don't want you to stop, I whispered. Harper let out a broken, shattered sound that was half sob, half growl. She reached for me, and the world absolutely exploded. End of Part 8. Part 9, the synaptic cleft. Her hands were everywhere at once. The moment I stepped into her space, Harper's fingers dug into my waist, pulling me flush against her body with a force that knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. She backed me up until my spine hit the edge of the mahogany desk, and then her mouth crashed down on mine. There was no hesitation this time, no careful testing of the boundary, no holding back. Kiss was absolute, desperate, and completely unhinged. It was the physical manifestation of a month of grueling restraint, of academic distance, of terrifying, suffocating longing. I melted into her immediately, my hands flying up to tangle in her dark hair, dislodging the severe clasp that held it back. The clip clattered to the floor somewhere in the shadows, and her hair tumbled over her shoulders in dark, silky waves, framing our faces as she kissed me breathless. "Emma!" she groaned against my mouth, the sound vibrating deep in her chest. She angled my head, her tongue sweeping past my lips, tasting of mint, chamomile, and an intoxicating dark hunger that made my knees completely buckle. If she hadn't been gripping my waist with such bruising intensity, I would have slid straight down to the floor. She stepped directly between my legs, pinning me to the wood of the desk, erasing every single millimeter of space between us. Contrast between the cold, authoritative professor I had known and the desperate, unraveling woman in my arms was staggering. Her hands slid up from my waist, her long, elegant fingers tracing the line of my ribs, her thumbs pressing firmly just beneath my breasts, making me arch into her with a soft, involuntary whimper. That sound seemed to completely shatter whatever remaining control she possessed. Harper's hands moved to frame my face, her thumbs tracing my cheekbones with a reverent, almost frantic urgency. She pulled back just a fraction of an inch, both of us panting, the air between us thick and electric. Her gray eyes were completely dilated, the storm in them wild and consuming. Her lips were swollen, red, and slightly parted. She looked entirely, beautifully wrecked. "You have no idea," Harper rasped, her voice trembling, her forehead resting heavily against mine. "You have absolutely no idea what you have done to me. Every time you walked into this office, every time you looked at me with those stubborn, brilliant eyes, I thought I was going to lose my mind. I thought you hated me," I whispered, my thumbs tracing the sharp, tense line of her jaw. "At the beginning. You were so cold." Harper let out a broken, self-deprecating laugh, her eyes fluttering shut. "I was terrified of you. From the very first seminar. You argued with me about neuroplasticity with such fierce, blinding conviction that it completely knocked me off balance. I have spent my entire career building an impenetrable fortress around myself, Emma. And you didn't even try to climb the walls. You just stood there and burned them down." She opened her eyes, and the sheer, naked vulnerability in her gaze made my heart physically ache. "I tried to push you away," she confessed, her hands sliding down to grip my shoulders. "I grated you harder. I was colder to you than anyone else because I knew that if I let you even an inch closer, this exact thing would happen. I knew I would not be able to stop myself from wanting you." "You don't have to push me away anymore," I said fiercely, my hands sliding down from her face to rest flat against her chest, directly over her heart. It was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my palm. "The exam is done. Protocol is blind. I'm not your student right now. I'm just me." Harper looked down at my hand resting over her heart, a slow, devastatingly tender smile breaking across her features. Transformed her entirely, stripping away the intimidating academic mask and leaving behind a woman who was breathtakingly, overwhelmingly beautiful. "Just you," she repeated softly. She leaned down and kissed me again, slower this time, but with a deep, resonant passion that sent a liquid heat pooling low in my stomach. Her hands slid down my arms, her fingers interlocking with mine, anchoring me to her. "We cannot stay here," Harper murmured against my lips, her breath warm on my skin. "The faculty building is emptying out, but if the dean decides to do a late afternoon walkthrough, explaining why my favorite student is currently pinned to my desk will be exceedingly difficult. I let out a breathless laugh, stepping back reluctantly. The sudden loss of her body heat left my skin buzzing with a phantom chill. "Where are we going?" Harper didn't answer immediately. She walked around the desk, her movements retaining that fluid, lethal grace, even though her hair was completely undone and her silk blouse was delightfully rumpled. She picked up her keys and her leather briefcase. "My car is in the faculty garage," she said, looking back at me with a gaze that was so heavy and dark it made my pulse skip a beat. "You are coming home with me." The drive to her apartment was a surreal experience. Harper drove a sleek, dark charcoal Audi that smelled faintly of new leather and that ubiquitous scent of bergamot. I sat in the passenger seat, my exhaustion from the exam completely overridden by the adrenaline humming through my veins. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the dashboard. Harper drove with the same effortless, commanding control she applied to everything else in her life. One hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, while the other, to my absolute shock, reached across the center console and firmly intertwined with mine. She didn't say a word, keeping her eyes fixed on the road, but her thumb stroked slow, soothing circles against the back of my hand. The simple, quiet intimacy of the gesture made my chest tight with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. I was holding hands with Dr. Harper Vance in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. The world had entirely shifted on its axis. Her apartment was exactly what I had expected, yet completely surprising. Located on the top floor of a high-end modern high-rise overlooking the city, it was sleek, minimalist, and dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in golden hour light. There were massive, towering bookshelves lining the walls, a grand piano tucked into a corner, and a plush, dark emerald velvet sofa that looked impossibly inviting. It was intimidatingly elegant, but it was also incredibly warm. Harper locked the heavy door behind us and dropped her keys into a silver bowl on the console table. She set her briefcase down, let out a long, shuddering exhale, and finally turned to face me. Without the academic setting to anchor us, the reality of what we were doing suddenly felt overwhelmingly large. We were standing in her private sanctuary, miles away from the university, stripped of our titles and our rules. I suddenly felt incredibly underdressed in my crumpled white blouse and dark trousers, smelling faintly of the examination hall. I crossed my arms over my chest, suddenly shy. Harper noticed the shift instantly. Her gray eyes softened, and she crossed the living room slowly, entirely closing the distance between us until she was standing just inches away. "You are shaking, Emma," she observed softly, reaching out to gently trace the line of my collarbone. "I think the adrenaline from the exam is finally wearing off," I admitted, my voice a little unsteady. "That and I keep expecting to wake up back in the library." Harper's expression turned fiercely protective. She moved her hand to cup the back of my neck, her thumb brushing against my pulse point. "You are not dreaming," she said firmly. "You survived the worst of it. The academic pressure, the exhaustion, my impossible standards, you beat all of it. You walked into that hall and proved that you belong in the upper echelon of medicine. I have never been more proud of a student in my entire life." My eyes stung with sudden hot tears. Hearing those words from her, the woman who demanded absolute perfection, was a validation so deep it settled into my very bones. "And," Harper continued, her voice dropping into a low, husky whisper as her gaze flicked down to my lips, "I have never wanted a woman more than I want you right now." Before I could even process the confession, she pulled me in. Kiss was slow, deep, and intoxicatingly thorough. There was no desk to pin me against, no fear of discovery to rush us. We had all the time in the world. Harper's hands slid down my back, pulling me tight against her as we moved blindly toward the velvet sofa. My back hit the soft cushions, and Harper followed me down, entirely caging me in with her body. Her weight was grounding, a heavy, warm reality that chased away the last lingering shadows of my anxiety. I hooked my arms around her neck, pulling her down closer, deepening the kiss until the rest of the world completely fell away. Her lips trailed from my mouth down to the sensitive skin of my jawline, her warm breath making me shiver violently. "You are entirely too brilliant, Emma," she murmured against my neck, her teeth grazing the skin right over my pulse point. "And entirely too brave. You terrify me." "Good," I gasped, my hands tangling in her dark, silky hair. "You needed to be terrified." Harper let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated right against my skin. She propped herself up on her forearms, looking down at me. Her hair was a messy halo around her face, her blouse was halfway unbuttoned from my wandering hands, and the storm in her eyes was entirely focused on me. "I suppose I did," she conceded softly. She leaned down and kissed me again, soft and lingering. 48 hours until the blind grading is complete. Until then, I am not letting you out of my sight. I smiled, pulling her back down against my chest, the frantic beating of our hearts perfectly aligned. I had walked into the darkest, most terrifying storm of my academic career, and I had come out the other side entirely consumed by the lightning. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Paradigm Shift. The sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harper's apartment was a soft, blinding gold when I finally woke up. For a long, disorienting moment, I didn't know where I was. My brain was still wired to expect the cramped, chaotic confines of my dorm room and the blaring, obnoxious tone of my 6 a.m. alarm. Instead, I was enveloped in an ocean of high-thread count cotton, surrounded by the faint, intoxicating scent of bergamot and rain. The heavy, warm weight of an arm was draped securely over my waist, pulling my back flush against a solid chest. I stopped breathing. The memories of the previous afternoon rushed back in a dizzying, vivid flood. The submission of the exam, the frantic run to the 4th floor, the absolute destruction of every boundary Dr. Harper Vance had ever built. I shifted slightly, trying to turn over without waking her, but the arm around my waist instantly tightened. "If you are attempting to sneak out to review neuroanatomy flashcards, I will personally fail you," Harper murmured, her voice a rough, sleep-heavy rasp that vibrated directly against my spine. I let out a soft, breathless laugh and rolled over to face her. Harper was a revelation in the morning light. Terrifying, immaculate professor was completely gone. Her dark hair was a tangled, beautiful mess across the white pillows. She was looking at me with half-open gray eyes, the storm in them replaced by a calm, quiet warmth that made my chest physically ache. Without the sharp lines of her tailored suits and the heavy armor of her academic title, she looked impossibly soft. "I don't have any flashcards left to review," I whispered, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair away from her face. "The exam is over, remember?" Harper leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. "I remember. I am simply having a very difficult time adjusting to a reality where I am actually allowed to hold you." She pulled me closer, burying her face in the crook of my neck. Her breath was warm against my skin, sending a lazy, delicious shiver down my spine. We lay there in the quiet stillness of the apartment, the distant hum of city traffic entirely muted by the heavy glass windows. Felt like we had slipped into a parallel universe, a suspended bubble of time where the university, the scholarship board, and the rest of the world simply didn't exist. Those 48 hours of waiting for the blind grading results were supposed to be absolute agony. Instead, they became a sanctuary. I didn't go back to my dorm. Harper completely refused to let me leave, claiming that my nervous system required a mandatory, heavily monitored decompression period. I texted Chloe that I was crashing at a friend's place to recover, turned my phone on silent, and surrendered entirely to the woman who had commandeered my life. It was an education of a completely different kind. I learned that Dr. Harper Vance, the feared head of neurological studies, drank her coffee black but kept a secret stash of incredibly sweet, expensive pastries in her kitchen. I learned that she played the piano when she was anxious, her long, elegant fingers moving across the keys with the same surgical precision she applied to grading papers. And I learned that beneath her cold, untouchable exterior was a woman who loved with a terrifying, absolute ferocity. On Saturday night, we were curled up on the dark emerald velvet sofa, a vintage medical journal abandoned on the coffee table. Harper was tracing slow, absent-minded patterns on my arm, her head resting back against the cushions. "I was going to leave academia," she said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. I shifted to look at her, surprised. "What? Why?" Harper didn't look at me immediately. She watched the city lights glittering outside the window. "Because the environment rewards detachment, demands that you treat students as statistics, as data points on a bell curve. I spent years cultivating that detachment. I thought it made me a better educator. I thought it protected me from the exhaustion of caring too much." She finally turned her head, her gray eyes locking onto mine with a heavy, piercing intensity. "And then you walked into my seminar," she murmured. "You were so bright, Emma. So incredibly, frustratingly stubborn. You cared about every single detail, every patient in the case studies. You refused to be detached. Watching you operate, it made my own armor feel suffocating. You made me realize that I didn't want to be an untouchable monolith. I just wanted to be near you." My throat tightened. I reached out, threading my fingers through hers. "You don't have to wear the armor with me. Never with me." Harper brought our joined hands to her lips, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to my knuckles. "I know. And that is the most terrifying, beautiful thing I have ever experienced." By Monday morning, the idyllic bubble was forcibly popped by the harsh reality of the academic calendar. The grading portal was scheduled to update at precisely 9 a.m. At 8:55 a.m., I was pacing the length of Harper's kitchen, a mug of untouched tea growing cold on the counter. The physical symptoms of panic were trying to claw their way back into my chest. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, and the catastrophic thoughts were spiraling. What if I misread the question? What if the blind graders were harsher than Harper? What if the dean rejected the reset anyway? Harper, dressed in a sleek, dark navy suit, ready to return to campus, watched me from the kitchen island. She set her coffee cup down and stepped smoothly into my path, catching me by the shoulders and halting my frantic pacing. "Breathe, Emma," she commanded, her voice dropping into that familiar, anchoring register. "I can't," I choked out, staring at the clock on the microwave. 8:58 a.m. "Harper, if I failed this, everything we just did, it's all tainted. Can't lose the scholarship. I can't let my mother down." Harper's hands tightened slightly on my shoulders. "Look at me." I forced my eyes away from the clock and met her gaze. The storm in her gray eyes was entirely calm, a solid, unbreakable wall of confidence. "You did not fail," she said with absolute, unwavering certainty. "I read your answers as you were writing them, Emma. I know exactly what you put on those pages. You dismantled that exam. You proved that you possess a brilliant, capable medical mind. A computer algorithm and 2 blind graders are not going to change that reality. You are going to pass, and you are going to keep your scholarship." She pulled me flush against her chest, wrapping her arms securely around me. I buried my face in her shoulder, inhaling the scent of bergamot, letting the steady, rhythmic beating of her heart ground my own frantic pulse. At exactly 9:01 a.m., my phone buzzed on the counter. An automated email notification from the university registrar. I pulled away from Harper, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I opened the email. There was no preamble, no gentle introduction. Just a link to the secure student portal. I clicked it, my breath completely suspended in my lungs. The screen loaded. Module Advanced Pre-Med Neurological Systems Reset. Candidate Emma Holloway. Status Passed High Merit. Final score 98%. I stared at the number. The digits didn't make sense for a solid 5 seconds. 98%. It wasn't just a pass. It was the highest recorded score in the entire cohort. It was higher than my original pre-burnout average. A sound tore out of my throat, a wet, shattered laugh that quickly dissolved into a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The massive, crushing weight that I had been carrying on my shoulders for the past month instantly evaporated, leaving me feeling lighter than air. "Well?" Harper asked softly, though the faint, proud curve of her lips told me she already knew the answer. 98, I breathed, looking up at her, tears spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. "I got a 98. Harper let out a long, heavy exhale, the last fraction of tension leaving her frame. She closed the distance between us in a single step, framing my face with both hands and kissing me with a fierce, possessive triumph that completely took my breath away. "I told you," she whispered against my lips, her thumbs brushing away my tears. "You are extraordinary." The return to campus that afternoon felt like stepping onto a completely different planet. The heavy, suffocating dread that used to accompany my walk to the science building was gone. I was no longer a frantic, desperate student fighting for survival. I had secured my scholarship, I had dominated the hardest module in the curriculum, and I was holding a secret that made my blood sing. I didn't have a class with Harper this semester, a deliberate, strategic choice to avoid any further ethical complications. She was my mentor, my anchor, and my fiercely guarded secret, but she was no longer my professor. 5 p.m., as the campus began to empty out under the cool, gray autumn sky, I found myself walking away from the main quad and toward the east wing. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked toward the abandoned, glass-ceiling botanical stairwell. Smelled exactly the same, damp earth, rain, and old stone. I walked up to the third step and stopped, looking down at the concrete where I had completely fallen apart just a month ago. I had been sitting right there, hyperventilating, entirely convinced that my life was over. The heavy fire door clicked open behind me. I didn't flinch this time. I turned around, a smile already breaking across my face. Dr. Harper Vance stood on the landing, wearing a breathtakingly sharp gray suit, holding her leather briefcase. She looked like the untouchable monarch of the faculty, cold and intimidating to anyone else who might have crossed her path. But when her gray eyes found mine in the dim light of the stairwell, the marble facade completely melted. She walked down the stairs, her heels clicking softly against the concrete, and stopped on the step directly above mine. "I had a feeling I might find you here," Harper said, her voice a low, melodic murmur that echoed in the quiet space. "I just wanted to see it," I admitted, reaching out to lightly grasp the lapel of her jacket. "This is where the house of cards collapsed." Harper stepped down onto my step, completely invading my personal space. She dropped her briefcase on the concrete, ignoring the expensive leather entirely, and wrapped both of her arms securely around my waist. "Houses of cards are meant to collapse, Emma," she said softly, leaning in until her forehead rested against mine. "They are fragile. They cannot withstand a storm." "And what are we building now?" I asked, looking up into the swirling, beautiful storm of her eyes. Harper smiled, a real, genuine, devastating smile that I knew belonged entirely to me. She brought one hand up to cup the back of my neck, her thumb resting directly over my steady, calm pulse. "We are building a fortress," she promised, her voice vibrating with a fierce, unbreakable conviction. "And I am never going to let it fall." She kissed me, slow and deep, right there on the concrete steps where everything had broken. Only this time, I wasn't falling apart. I was completely, beautifully, and irreversibly held. End of story. Wow, just wow. Let's all take a deep collective breath together because that was intense. Welcome back to reality, everyone, and thank you so much for sticking with me through all 10 parts of Emma and Harper's incredible journey. This is your GL girlfriend, and I just had to take a few minutes to sit down and talk with you guys about everything we just experienced. Let's break this down because my heart is still racing. The transition we see in Dr. Harper Vance, going from this terrifying, untouchable ice queen of the faculty to becoming Emma's absolute safe space, is honestly one of my favorite tropes of all time. But what makes this story hit so deeply isn't just the romance, it's the raw, crushing reality of burnout. Emma was a literal house of cards. She was carrying the weight of her medical scholarship, her mother's pride, and her own devastating perfectionism. I think so many of us can relate to that, right? Pushing ourselves to the absolute brink until our bodies just forcibly shut us down. And then there's Harper. Oh, Harper. She built a fortress around herself because her world rewarded cold detachment. But seeing her immaculate composure completely unravel the second Emma shattered on those concrete stairs, that was everything. I absolutely loved how the story used the actual medical curriculum, the fight-or-flight response, the sympathetic nervous system, the blood-brain barrier, as a metaphor for their own building tension. It was so clever. And can we just take a moment to appreciate that blind grading protocol? The ultimate academic loophole that let them finally cross that line without ruining Emma's hard-earned future. But now I want to hear from you. I am dying to know your thoughts. Let's chat in the comments. First question: what was the absolute most intense moment for you in this story? Was it the power outage in the office when Harper almost lost her control in the dark? Or was it that explosive moment right after the exam was submitted when Emma finally walked around that mahogany desk? Second question: have you ever experienced that kind of overwhelming academic or work pressure where you just desperately needed someone to catch you before you fell? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one and I really want to talk about this with you guys. If you loved this story as much as I did, and if your heart was beating out of your chest during those late-night tutoring sessions, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know what kind of stories you want to hear more of. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and join the Your GL Girlfriend family. Make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss another intense, beautiful, slow-burn GL romance. We have so many more amazing stories coming up, and I want you all right here with me to experience them. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening, for commenting, and for being such a wonderful, supportive community. You guys are the absolute best. Remember to take care of yourselves today. Drink some water, take a deep breath, and remember that you don't have to be perfect. Houses of cards are meant to fall sometimes. Sending you all so much love. I will see you in the next video. Bye.